Okay, so just like we have seen data binding concept in case of WPF, so wherein we discussed about few facts. So if you recall the data binding session, we discussed about there are the data binding problem or data binding exists because of the problem which lies in two different areas. So one area governed by somebody called as WPF runtime, and one more which is area governed by CLR. So what happens is, assuming this is the area which is run by WPF runtime, and assuming this is the area which is governed by, let's say, CLR, ultimately some sort of entity that we can consider here. So take an example, some class is acting as a data source over here. So one more time I'll put up here, some class acting as a data source, or class object as data source, I should say, as data source. Now this class object data source is going to hand over data to somebody called as WPF runtime. Rather, I should say undo this here, and I should have an arrow from here. Now by default, what happens is, if there is a WPF element or control like text box that we have, we saw it, that is, whenever there's a change which happens from UI side, there's a change which is immediately conveyed to CLR. And then we saw this one way towards source kind of change happens automatically. But then when it comes to the other way, that is whenever change happens through code, in case of something called as data source, you will notice that that change is not going to work or never reflect automatically in WPF. Reason behind that, you need to notify to WPF runtime that I change, you also change. And for that reason, we talked about I notify property change or dependency property concept, if you recall. Now keeping that in mind, which is ultimately a concept which drives the binding as in concept in case of WPF, we also discussed about one more fact, which is element to element binding, which means not considering class object as a data source, but then one element in case of WPF acting as a source and the other element acting as a kind of target itself, which means we talked about one source and the target itself is element itself. So we saw a concept of element to element binding, if you recall, wherein the example what we discussed was there was some sort of slider and text box or ellipse kind of example, if you recall. So this example was for element to element binding that we saw. Now I should say E to E binding. Okay. Now here also, like in any of the case, whether it is class object acting as a data source or whether it is E to E kind of a binding, you'll always notice the binding was always between properties. So there was some getter setter on the left and there was always some getter setter on the right. Now what we need to understand is a concept called as triggers. So whenever some property change happened, we did notify to the other area again that so and so property has changed, and now it's time to change the target property itself. So now here we would like to change the property based on certain things. So in case of WPF, we have a concept which is called as trigger. And then normally we have routine three different types of triggers. One, we call it as property trigger. The other one that we have, I should mention here trigger. Then there is another concept that we have which is called as event trigger, or I should say data trigger, the easiest one. And then the third one that we have is called as event trigger, which means whenever some X property changes, can be a property of the same control itself. So whenever some property of some control changes, then for that control itself, you can convey, since the property so and so has changed for X control, for that X control, now the Y property should change. Which means Y property change can be some event handler. But keep it in mind, that is something we will never write in C#. we will prefer to write it in case of XAML itself. Second thing, in case of data trigger, whenever some sort of data bound property changes, then UI should change itself or some other controls should change itself. For that also, we will not be writing C# code, we will be writing entire thing in XAML itself. And finally comes up event trigger, which to some extent you have seen in case of animation demonstration. So we mentioned what should happen is some animation should happen in the user control project in Blend, if you recall. So what we did was on a button click we tried to do 2D animation, but then we did not write any piece of code in the code behind, that is C#. We handled everything through the XAML itself. So what we need to understand is that was through concept called as event trigger, which means instead of you writing C# based plus equal to code like event on the left and after plus equal to on the right, you should have a delegate ultimately pointing to some event handler or a method. So instead of rewriting that piece of code in case of C#, event trigger concept basically manages this thing in case of XAML itself, wherein the XAML itself will have an event handler ultimately from the animation perspective or some UI perspective, and the event is handled ultimately as through the event trigger concept. So these three different types of triggers exist. We will understand these triggers one by one. So let's start with property trigger first.